Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, she claims to speak in the name of the people. And like other populists before her, from Donald Trump to Venezuela's late Hugo Chavez, France's would-be president, Marine Le Pen, dismisses her critics as a corrupt elite out of touch with ordinary, hardworking citizens. But in fact, says my guest today, Jan-Werner Müller, it's populists such as Le Pen who are dangerously out of touch. For all their talk of unifying polarized nations, they behave less like Democrats and more like dictators. Dictators bent on flouting the people's will. Now, Müller's a professor of political theory at Princeton University. He's also the author of several books and essays on the history of political ideas, including, most recently, What is Populism?, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And he joins me today from Geneva, Switzerland. Thank you very much for taking the time, Mr. Müller, for being with us. I'd like to ask you a question in the broader context. We're obviously in the midst of between two rounds of the French election. Let's draw a line, a straight line between Donald Trump, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Hugo Chavez, the late Venezuelan president, Marine Le Pen, and even Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. What do they all have in common? We know they're populists, but beyond that, what would you say they have in common?
Well, they all do say that they and only they represent the people, or what sometimes populists also call the real people. So that implies that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate, that all independent institutions which oppose them, from constitutional courts to independent media, can be attacked in the name of the real people and in the eyes of these leaders in the name of democracy. And maybe less obviously, all those citizens who don't share these leaders' views about the supposedly real people and hence don't support them politically, all these citizens can have their status as properly belonging to the people put into doubt. So populists at the core, I believe, are always anti-pluralists, and they always exclude on two levels. At the level of party politics, at the level of elites, where they deny the legitimacy of their opponents, but less obviously also at the level of citizens themselves. So it's not an accident that they persecute their critics very often, that they at the very least exclude minorities.
What do you do, though? Put yourself in the position of an Emmanuel Macron, the centrist, her centrist opponent in this election. How do you counter this message? Because for better or for worse, it does resonate with a lot of French people. What do you do if she's dismissing you as illegitimate, you're running against her, you somehow have to counter that message? What do you say? How do you behave? How do you act?
So let's not assume that all voters of populist politicians are anti-pluralists in the sense that I described a minute ago. They might be attracted by particular policy promises, by particular other messages of these populist politicians. So I think one has to find out what particular issues are of importance to them and then plausibly respond, also plausibly argue with populists and try to show that one has better answers, better policy ideas, and so on. And beyond that, of course, there might be some who really are intolerant, who might be tempted by the more authoritarian messages which populists also convey. And in those cases, I think one also has to make the best case one can for a tolerant, inclusive, pluralist society where one, in a sense, tries to counter the often very restrictive visions of collective identity put forward by populists with more inclusive ones.
We saw in the case of Donald Trump, he was a billionaire who had built a real estate empire claiming to speak for the little people. Marine Le Pen might not be quite as rich as Donald Trump, but she has inherited a lot of wealth and has a lot of properties. Do you see any contradiction or any paradox in the fact of you have quite a few populists with a lot of inherited wealth claiming to speak for basically poor people, down and out on their luck, often people without jobs looking for work?
The promise of the populist is not really, I'm like everybody else, or I'm like the person on the street. Their promise is to say, I and only I know the real people's authentic will, and only I will properly execute it. So from that point of view, it was even a kind of advantage for Trump that he could say, look, I have so much money, I can't be corrupted. I don't have to give speeches at Goldman Sachs. I have my own money. I'm not saying, therefore, that's true, but that can actually be a certain kind of advantage. The other thing, though, that is, I think, more puzzling in a certain way, is that, of course, very often populists, initially when they run for office, say, we are against corruption, the old elite is corrupt, we're going to clean up. And then it turns out when they're in power, they turn out to be even more corrupt than predecessors, if indeed they were corrupt at all. And that is very baffling because very often their support doesn't disappear even in these cases. And my suspicion is that very often their supporters don't even see it as corruption, but as something more like a welfare state for the real people, i.e. for them and not for those who don't properly belong. Otherwise, it's very hard to explain how, given the levels of corruption in countries like Turkey and Hungary, nevertheless, these regimes have turned out to be relatively stable and, in quotation marks, successful up until this point.
And it is interesting because we were talking about as well, reporting that, in Donald Trump's case, a lot of his administration in the White House are former Wall Street executives, Goldman Sachs, and so on. And yet I believe that only the latest poll showing 2% of his supporters, only 2% of his supporters really have doubts about having voted for him, which is interesting. But here in Europe, we've had quite a few of the European leaders in Brussels embracing right after the first round, embracing Emmanuel Macron, throwing their support behind him. In your estimation, because they are portrayed by populists like Marine Le Pen as being part of the establishment, the system, can this work against an Emmanuel Macron? Will having the so-called establishment endorsing him perhaps work against him?
So no doubt this will confirm the view of especially those who see sort of Europe as a big conspiracy against the people anyway. But I don't see this as a decisive move one way or the other. I think there's a broader question about the role of the European Commission. On the one hand, it's meant to be the guardian of the treaties and an effectively much more neutral, if you like, technocratic institution. Then it becomes problematic if they start to endorse particular national leaders. On the other hand, of course, there have been some voices over the last couple of years who've said that actually the Commission should be politicized because that can contribute to the democratization of Europe. And the idea that the president of the Commission might even one day become directly elected by the people of Europe would point in that direction. So I think there's a more interesting challenge hiding here about what exactly the role of the European institutions is. It's not necessarily a bad thing if they become more political, but then that also has to be made clear, and one can't have it both ways. One can't, on the one hand, pretend to be a sort of purely rational technocratic institution, and then at the same time come out politically too directly in a certain way.
What would happen if, as Marine Le Pen has stated as part of her platform, she were to hold a referendum on France's future in the European Union? She'd like to pull France out of Europe, pull it out of the single currency, and basically reinstate borders. That is, put an end to the Schengen zone of open borders among 26 countries. In your estimation, is there any saving grace in that message? Could it work?
Well, no, it would certainly be the end of the Europe that we know. But I think it's important also to consider the fact that an end of Europe, which a lot of people have been talking about recently, could take many forms. So something like a Frexit, something like a quasi-official implosion of the Union, that's one possibility. But I think that's still a relatively remote possibility. Something that is already happening, and that arguably is much less obvious, relates to somebody that you mentioned earlier, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Orban has already found a way to be both inside and outside the European Union at the same time. He gets all the money from Brussels, and yet he doesn't really play by the rules. And that leads to a sort of slow process of erosion that touches the very political core of the European Union, which, after all, was never just an economic project. It was always a political project to do with peace and eventually also democracy. So if it becomes possible to erect a populist, in many ways already authoritarian regime at the very heart of the EU, and nobody does anything against or about it, that's already in a certain way the end of Europe as it should be. It's just much less obvious. It doesn't come with a big bang.
And we have very little time left, but I want to ask you, as you said, we're starting to see some erosion there. Do you see, though, however, on the other end, the beginnings perhaps of a backlash against populism, against that recent wave in Europe, given what we saw in Austria, given the Netherlands elections, and you have upcoming elections in Germany as well? Do you see perhaps the populists losing some ground in the near to medium term?
I believe both that the conventional image of a kind of inevitable wave of populism, first Brexit, then Trump, and then some other big populist win in Europe, was wrong, but so is this idea of necessarily a post-populist moment. The first image is wrong because no populist on their own has yet delivered a big victory. In every single case, populists have needed the support of conservative elites. That was true in the UK with Brexit, that was true with Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So a very important question in the context of France is if major conservative elites are really willing to support Marine Le Pen, which at this point doesn't seem likely.
And that's
but it's also too simplistic to say that, after the Dutch elections, we're already in the post-populist moment. Because it's one thing to be a populist who says, I and only I represent the people. It's another thing that some of these populists are pushing particular policies to do with immigration. And the official populists can lose, as Wilders did, and as Marine Le Pen probably will, and yet some of their messages might be picked up by mainstream actors. So when Mark Rutte, for instance, the mainstream
Jan-Werner Müller,
Prime Minister of the Netherlands, started to have...
I'm sorry, but we are going to have to end it there. I'm sorry to cut you off in mid-thought, mid-sentence, but we're going to have to leave it sort of midway in your sentence, but also midway towards the French election runoff on May 7th. A lot of questions being asked about the populists, what some say is the threat posed by Marine Le Pen, and whether or not we're perhaps seeing a turn against populists here in Europe slowly. But thank you for joining me today, and thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news ahead.